This episode is brought to you by Sterling Soap Company. Fellas, you've heard the phrase, look good, feel good, right? But why not add smell good to that too? That's where Sterling Soap Company comes in. First, Sterling Soap is 100% natural and has a wide variety of bath soaps, shave soaps, beard balm, lotions, and cologne. Second, there's a scent just for you. How about burgundy? Yeah, it's more than a color. The Sterling Soap folks blend natural essential oils with hints of mahogany, golden amber, and sandalwood. Or how about D503, an intensely masculine scent inspired by Legend by Mont Blanc. And third, you will feel good about the price. For just a little more than you'd pay at the grocery store, Sterling Soap will leave you feeling clean, refreshed, and ready for whatever's next. Give Sterling Soap a try today. Visit sterlingsoap.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Sports from back in the day. From Atlanta, it's Dana on the mic, talking old school legends, bringing history to life. We go deep like a spiral in the Superdome, back when athletes let the game do the talking alone. Jordan fadeaways, Jackie in the zone, Ali in the ring, man, he stood all alone. From the Negro Leagues to the ABA, we break it all down, yeah, the classic way. It's Charles from the district, straight out the boot. Southern University pride, rapping truth in the booth. From Baton Rouge to the nation's capital, legends on deck. Yeah, we factual, tales of the greats, gold chains and all. Baseball, who dreams in that football brawl? No clickbait, no fluff, just the facts will say. It's historically speaking, sports from back in the game. So sit back, tune in, and hit replay. It's historically speaking sports, the classic way.
September 3rd, 1995 was the start of the 76th season of the National Football League. The San Francisco 49ers were the defending Super Bowl champions, and every team was looking at the new season with hope, possibilities, and opportunities. For two of the now 30 teams in the National Football League, the hope, possibilities, and opportunities were new. On this early fall afternoon in 1995 were the first games of the Carolina Panthers and the Jacksonville Jaguars as newly minted members of the National Football League. Though they both lost their season opening games of the regular season, no one had any idea just 16 months later, some 497 days later, both will be playing for the right to play in Super Bowl XXXI. Hello, this is Dana Augusta, the co-host of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, the podcast that gives you the best of sports from back in the day. My co-host, Charles Combs, will be with you shortly. In this all-new edition of the podcast, Charles and I will take a look at the first two seasons of the Carolina Panthers and Jacksonville Jaguars that shocked fans and football experts alike as they crawled from expansion obscurity to the darlings of the NFL in a mere 2 seasons. Later in the show, we'll send a shout out to one of the members of the Carolina Panthers who embodied the leadership and toughness of that team that was one step away from the Super Bowl, an undersized linebacker that came up with the team's motto that still follows today, and thus far, the only player to have his number retired by the team. All that and more coming up on this all-new episode of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, a member of the Sports History Network.
Hey there, Welcome to Music Meets Sports, where sports legends meet custom soundtracks. Founded by music producer Ronald Tyke Oliver, Music Meets Sports was created to bridge generations, educate fans, and celebrate the greatness of both current and former athletes. We craft original songs about heroes in basketball, football, baseball, boxing, and beyond, highlighting their struggles and victories. Across all musical genres, we reintroduce fans to their favorite athletes in a way they've never heard before. From Babe Ruth to Reggie White, from rising WNBA stars to timeless NFL great stream, or download our music now on Apple Music, Amazon, and Spotify. Visit musicmeetsports.org to explore the catalog, hear new releases, and join the movement that's preserving sports history, one song at a time.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, and you are tuned in to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, coming to you live and direct from the studios here in Atlanta, Georgia. I'm Dana Augusta, along with my co-host Charles Combs, who's joining us from Louisiana. Glad to have him aboard once again. Charles, how you doing tonight?
I'm doing very good. Looking forward to tonight's topic. I'm just still on an elated high from yesterday. Shout out to my main man, Terrence Bud Crawford, 3 times undisputed, cemented his Mount Rushmore status last night with a victory over fellow all-time great Canelo Alvarez. Man, tremendous fight. Bud had all the tools in the bag on display last night. Great fight.
I saw that fight was going on last night, and I was wondering, wondering if you had knew about it, but at the same time, I was like, of course he knew about it. Of course he did. So anyway, since you're joining us, we want to talk about what we're going to be discussing here tonight and just highlight some of that. We've had a number of expansion teams over the last several years to be uncharacteristically successful in their first years. You've seen it a lot in hockey, where you had the Vegas Golden Knights going to the Stanley Cup Finals in their first season, going all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals, ultimately losing, and then just a few years later winning the whole thing. And the early success of these Seattle Kraken over in the National Hockey League. And then you had teams like the Florida Marlins win the World Series in only their third or fourth year of existence. You've seen it in the NBA with the Milwaukee Bucks, with the team with the teaming together of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Oscar Robertson winning the NBA championship in 1971 in only their third year of existence. But we're going to turn our attention to the National Football League. And during the decade of the 1990s, you had 2 expansion teams that literally came out of nowhere. From their first game, the Carolina Panthers and the Jacksonville Jaguars was expected to not do as well as most of the NFL besides their expansion teams. But in just a span of 17 months, each of them were 1 win away from playing in Super Bowl 31. That's in less than 2 seasons, they turned it around and was 1 win away from playing in New Orleans in Super Bowl 31. And so tonight, we're going to have a little discussion about the first 2 years of those 2 franchises. And before we get started, Charles, from your own recollection, what do you remember of those teams?
I remember that they were, the colors obviously, and then was a bit more familiar with Carolina since they were in the NFC West, because even though I've always been a football fan, I've always been more of an NFC type of guy. And then just kind of remembered like a lot of, usually as, per usual with expansion teams in any sport, the cast-offs, the non-essentials, if I may add, usually they just, the expansion draft, the teams just avail the players that they don't want to the expansion draft for the expansion teams to take. And then that's mostly what the expansion teams are comprised of, with the exception of their draft picks, which to your point is why it's so shocking that these teams had such quick success, being hampered with that.
Well, when I think of those two teams, I just think of, and a lot of this we're going to get into later. One thing that you touched on is that their identity was essentially born of the 90s. You look at their colors and they still have the same colors. They haven't really changed their uniforms colors or anything drastically over the years what I thought was so very interesting was the fact that they played each other the first week of this season in the NFL regular season, which I thought was kind of cool, celebrating their 30th season, 30 years of their inaugural seasons. But one thing I remember about them was that they were built so completely different from each other. The Carolina Panthers were built upon mainly through free agency and veteran players, and they were cast-offs, sure, but a lot of those cast-offs were very, very good players, to say the least. Meanwhile, the Jaguars were completely built through the draft. Their number one pick overall, Tony Baselli, was one of the best offensive linemen in NFL history that no one really talks about, I think. His numbers retired by the Jaguars. And both teams were built so differently, but at the same time, they eventually, found success in various different ways. It took the Jags a little bit longer, but their staying power of success, actually, the Jags' success lasted a little bit longer than Carolina's success, because Carolina, I guess you could consider, was somewhat of a flash in the pan type of team, because soon after that 1997 season, they kind of fell off. Meanwhile, the Jags were playing in the AFC Championship game going as far as 2000. So it was either 99 or 2000. They were in the AFC Championship game. So the team had a little bit more staying power than the Panthers. But before we get into really the nuts and bolts of these two teams, let's give you a little history lesson before we get into what happened in the 90s. And Jacksonville, and surprisingly doing research, Jacksonville and Carolina, Charlotte, had pro football teams in their respective cities before the Panthers and Jags came along. Now, first off, let's talk about expansion at this point in the NFL. In 1960, which basically is the start of expansion in the NFL, that was what is labeled in modern parlance as the modern era of the NFL, the expansion era, as you will, in the NFL. The Cowboys, and notice the records here. The Cowboys, their first season, 1960, 0-11-1. Vikings, 1961, their first season. Now, they won their very first, the inaugural game. First team ever to win their first game, their inaugural game. The first one, the only other team to do that was the Houston Texans in 2002, beating the Cowboys. But the Vikings in 1961, they beat the Bears in their first game, but could only win two more games after that, going 3-11-0. The Falcons in 1966, they went 3-11-1. The Saints, despite despite John Gilliam's 95-yard touchdown run in their opening game, lost to the Rams in 1967. They finished the year 3-11-0. Now, over in the AFL, you had two expansion teams. The Miami Dolphins came in 66. They went 3-11-0. And the Cincinnati Bengals in 1968, they also went 3-11-0. So you see all of this so far. Now, the other two we're going to get into in a bit. But when you look at these teams, you see something of a pattern here. You don't get a lot of success right away, in their first years. And to your point, Chuck, a lot of these teams getting the cast-offs, the never words, the young players that nobody wants, that's what you normally see in these expansion teams in the beginning.
Correct. And usually they, you usually get like the cast-offs, the never words, and or sometimes you'll get the cap casualty guy. He made a name for himself, but he's old and past it and far past his best days. And then they bring him in and just kind of, I think a lot of times just for name brand recognition to kind of get the people interested in coming out, even if his current production level isn't suitable anymore. But yeah, it's just You just get a lot of that, and it's very, very difficult because, usually, to your point, like how differently the Jags and the Panthers were built. The same goes for the coaching staffs a lot of times. Like a lot of times in your the past expansion teams, for instance, they either have an old established coach or they may go the same vehicle via the Tampa Bay Buccaneers that you're probably going to get to shortly, where they got like a very good college coach in John McKay, but then on the offset or disadvantage of that is a lot of times that the coach is also learning the ropes of the NFL along with a lot of the cast off players and the younger players, which a lot of times can be a big time attribute to the lack of success.
Right. And you look at, like, for example, you mentioned that you get like a lot of players that go to these teams that are past their prime, trying to get some guys to come in. For example, get the fans interested in a new team with an old player that was very good at once upon a time. The best example of that was with the Minnesota Vikings. In 1961, they had got Hugh McElhenney, aka the King, which one of the best great running backs of the 1950s for the San Francisco 49ers. He ended his career with the Vikings, hoping to get some notoriety and and get some fans in the seats at Metropolitan Stadium to get to come out to check them out. And of course, he was well past his prime, but then again, that first Sunday against the Bears, they had a young quarterback from Athens, Georgia, named Francis Asbury Tarkington, who threw like 3 touchdown passes and had like 300 yards passing that day, to beat George Halas's Bears. And then moving on to the 70s. Now, this was very interesting, and I did not realize this until like maybe a number of years ago, that the teams that added 2 more teams in 1976, the Seattle Seahawks and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But the NFL did something I think was really novel and really weird at the same time. The Buccaneers actually started as an AFC team, and the Seahawks was an NFC team. And the theory was that they would start that way and have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers play every team in the AFC, and the Seahawks play every team in the NFC that one year. So they had no divisions. Essentially, they had no division rival where they would play twice. They would play everybody in the conference once. And they did that in 1976. Seahawks went 2-12-0. Okay. And of course, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers lost all of their games. They went 0-14. The next season, 1977, Seahawks go to the AFC West, where they would stay for like 1,000 years. And the Buccaneers would go to the NFC Central. And the same thing, they did the same thing. The Buccaneers played everybody in the NFC, and the Seahawks played everybody in the AFC. And the Buccaneers finally won their first game October 16th, 1977, against your team, the New Orleans Saints, in New Orleans. So, I thought that was kind of weird. I did not know this until like a number of years ago, that the Seahawks and Bucks played everybody at least once in their first 2 seasons in the National Football League.
Wow. I'm just learning something new today. I didn't know that until you just mentioned it. And then that's a novel and a weird concept. But question for you. Do you think that is possibly market introduction based? Like, for example, if they have to play every team in one conference one year, then subsequently get switched to the other conference, then that means pretty much every other market gets introduced to them at least once.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, was that part of the thinking or part of the plan that the NFL had in mind?
I think that plan was kind of twofold. One, it was in the terms of marketing. I really believe that it had more to do with marketing than what I thought the second reason was, and that is basically every team in the National Football League had a chance to at least get one win, okay, against these new expansion teams. But I think it had more to do with marketing than, say, giving everybody in the league at least one easy win. But I think it had a lot to do with, getting a new team introduced to every other market in the National Football League for the first 2 years of their existence.
That's actually pretty smart. And then, of course, as you just outlined a few moments ago, every team gets an easy type of win, like a homecoming type of game, whether it's home or road. And of course, the New Orleans Saints couldn't manage to do that either. They lost. Used to call them the Yucks in those days.
Yep.
Just lost to the Bucks. So of course, they couldn't even manage to take care of a clear setup.
I mean, and the thing is that that's why I think a lot of teams looked at it as it was like an easy win, kind of a homecoming type of deal, when the Bucks and the Seahawks came to town. But if you would notice, of those two expansion teams of the Seahawks and Bucks, the Bucks made the playoffs before the Seahawks did, and they were one win away from going to Super Bowl 14, losing to the Rams in the NFC Championship game in '79 with Doug Williams and Leroy Selman and James Wilder and that bunch. One win away, being victimized by 3 Frank Corral field goals by the Rams and ending the worst to first, Tampa Bay Buccaneers season from 1979. Now, moving forward a couple of decades, to the mid 1990s, with the creation of the Carolina Panthers and the Jacksonville Jaguars, and we're gonna get into like their creation and stuff like that. We're gonna touch on that a little bit, but before then, the '90s was not the first time that the Charlotte area and the Jacksonville area had hosted pro football, and I thought this was really interesting. Okay. They had previous teams there. They had something called in the mid 70s. Some people that are old enough to remember this. They had something called the World Football League that essentially tried to play summer football, but it was like this is before the USFL. This is in the 70s, and the biggest thing about that team was like they got a lot of notoriety because they started trying to get players from the NFL to join these teams. Most notably, they took 3 key members of the Dolphins' perfect season 1972 team and added them to WFL rosters. Jim Kick, Paul Warfield, Larry Zonka left the Dolphins to join the World Football League, and eventually came back because the league was, to say that it was on shaky ground is putting it really lightly. Case in point, there was the one of the flagship franchises was a team called the New York Stars. The team was so shaky, one, they couldn't find a place to play in New York City. At the time, Yankee Stadium was being renovated. Then they couldn't play at Shea Stadium because the Mets, the Yankees, the Jets, and the Giants were all playing there at Shea Stadium during the 1974-1975 year. So the New York Stars had nowhere to play. They ended up playing at Randall's Island at Downing Stadium, and the place was just, it was run down, built in the 30s. Basically, high school teams really didn't even want to play there. So they ended up moving to Charlotte in the middle of the 1974 season. This is a team that moved in the middle of a season to another city. That's how shaky ground the WFL was. They ended up moving to Charlotte and played the rest of the 1974 season at the Charlotte Stars until 1975 when they changed their name to, guess this, the Charlotte Hornets. For 1 year, they played as the Charlotte Hornets. Now that again, one of the things that you realize, one of the things when you do research on sports history, you find like a little quirk. And this is the quirk of all quirks right here.
Mm-hmm. And Charlotte Hornets, that's old George Sheehan. Boy,
Yep.
The pretty good team. And then kind of the back into it a little bit. I know Jerry Robinson, Richardson, rather, I'm sorry.
Jerry
I
Richardson.
didn't know this in my research. I didn't know that, he used to play for the Baltimore Colts, and
Yes, right.
and I'm assuming he was a wide receiver.
Yes, it
He was
was.
on the other side of Raymond Berry and played with Johnny Unitas and
Yep.
all of that. And then he kind of used his proceeds from the 1959 league championship year to open the first Hardee's restaurant, which he turned into a conglomerate of other things to
Right.
amass a bunch of wealth and influence, which eventually led to him announcing the NFL franchise bid in 1987 and all of that, which was awarded in 1995. So it's kind of crazy how everything kind of not only comes full circle football wise, but then, of course, as you know, in basketball, around a few years before, ironically, the NBA had awarded Charlotte a franchise, and they were ironically named the Hornets.
Exactly. Now, Jacksonville had a team before this too. They had the team called the Jacksonville Bulls of the USFL. Now, when I think of the Jacksonville Bulls, first of all, they had the coolest helmets I had ever seen. It was basically on each side, it was a silver helmet with a charging buffalo and a charging bull on both sides. But the actual logo was actually wrapped around the helmet, and on the back of the helmet it spelled out Bulls, which I thought was like really unique. The team lasted 2 years, 1984, 1985, the final 2 years of the USFL. And they started out as the Washington Federals. And if anybody remembers the early years of the USFL, everybody remembers how bad the Washington Federals were playing at RFK Stadium. They moved to I'm sorry, I got all that wrong. Their first game was a win against the Washington Federals. The Washington Federals eventually became, I want to say, the Orlando Renegades, but coached by Lee Corso. So their first game, they beat the Washington Federals 53-14. Okay, that lets you know how bad the Federals were. But the NFL saw the number of people that were attending the Bulls games. In fact, 2 years, for the 2 years that they've existed in the USFL, Jacksonville led the league in attendance. So they looked at the attendance figures of people going to the Gator Bowl, and they were like, wow, they may have something in Jacksonville, but they were hesitant of going there because of Jacksonville's size. It wasn't really a big major league city, according to NFL standards. Now, check this out. Some of the alumni of the Jacksonville Bulls. Future New Orleans Saints linebacker Vaughn Johnson, former Cleveland Browns quarterback Brian Sipe, and you will love this, Chuck, future Redskins wide receiver Gary Clark. They all came from the Jacksonville Bulls during those first 2 seasons of the last 2 seasons of the USFL during the 1980s.
Yes, sir. I remember them guys. I used to love Brian Sipe. He used to be in Cleveland. He used to have his hands. He used to have his hands in his crotch before he snapped. Because he used to be so cold out there. He used to play with no gloves on. So I remember that. And of course, who wouldn't remember Vaughn Johnson nor Gary Clark? And since USFL, just got to shout out Michigan Panthers, Bobby Abel, Anthony Carter, baby.
That's
they
right.
Used to be lethal in the USFL, man.
You talk about lethal.
Michigan Panthers.
You talk about lethal. You talk about lethal.
Yeah.
Another USFL that we're going to talk about a little bit later. Another USFL alumnus is a guy by the name of Sam Mills that we're going to talk about a little bit later at length in our shout out segment. So please stay tuned for that. Now, you mentioned earlier, Chuck, that the Carolina Panthers, founded in the early 90s by Jerry Richardson, who was a former player for the Colts. I think, if I'm not mistaken, he was the first owner to be a former player, to have an expansion franchise. Now, everybody knows that, George Halas was a former player, and he founded the Chicago Bears, but Jerry Richardson in the, I guess you could consider, modern era of the NFL, Jerry Richardson was the first ex-player to own a team. Now, let's talk about the birth of the Panthers. They became a franchise on October 26, 1993, owned by Jerry Richardson. The Panthers' first GM was Bill Polian, who made a name for himself building the Buffalo Bills. In fact, he brought a lot of his former Bill players to Charlotte for the Panthers in that first couple of years to establish that we're going to build a team through free agency and through former few older players and stuff like that to build like something of a winning formula right away in Carolina. And in the first years, it really showed.
Yeah, they did very well. And speaking of Bill Polian and the influx of Buffalo Bills, in that time, he big time nucleus to those teams that went to 4 consecutive Super Bowls, didn't win any of them. They had Frank Wright, Don Beebe, Pete Metzelaars.
That's right.
And linebacker Carlton Bailey, brought them in as free agents, and then kind of had the old coach, the old master and the innovator of the zone blitz scheme, Dom Capers.
That's right.
You're the first one doing the zone blitz scheme and all of that, and brought him in. He was defensive coordinator for the Steelers, brought him in. So you had to really try to establish a really good culture from two predominantly winning programs and two predominantly professional programs, being the Steelers and the Buffalo Bills. And to your point, after going 0-5, they won their first game against the Jets 26-15, and then finished the season 7-9. So they went on a bit of a run. Took them a while to find their footing, but went on a bit of a run a little bit, which we'll definitely talk about in just a moment. Really set the catalyst and the momentum for that following season.
That's right. Looking at the coaching staff and the guys that were part of that early coaching staff, there's a couple of names that are actually familiar to today's NFL fan. Vic Fangio was a linebackers coach for that team, who's now the defensive coordinator for the world champions Philadelphia Eagles. Also, Greg Roman, who at the time with the Panthers that first year was the quality control coach for the defense, but was now the offensive coordinator for my LA Chargers. I almost said San Diego, my God. But for my LA Chargers, he's the offensive coordinator under Jim Harbaugh. So you mentioned Don Capers, the man with the zone blitz scheme of with the Pittsburgh Steelers of the 90s, and he would get one of his best students to come to Carolina in their second season. But moving on to the other team that was joining them in the 1995 regular season, which would be the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, before we get into that, before you talk about anything about the Jaguars, you have to talk about this. And that how they made a car company mad. Because in the beginning, their colors was going to be teal, of course, gold, of course, but silver. And their helmets, if anybody could Google their first ever helmets, it were silver helmets with a teal and gold stripe down the center, and they had a leaping jaguar on each side. However, General Motors, Jaguar, which is a subsidiary of General Motors, had not filed a lawsuit, which I thought they did, but they just basically said, yo, we don't want you to use our logo. And you look at the Jaguar logo on the helmet and the actual Jaguar car company logo, it looks a lot alike. So I can understand where they were coming from. So that's why they had to scrap that. It was a good looking helmet, by the way. I'm not even going to lie. But they had to scrap that. And then that's when they went with the classic Jaguar head with the teal tongue. So that's where the teal came from. 1 month after the NFL awarded Charlotte an NFL franchise, Jacksonville beat out St. Louis in 1993 for the 30th NFL franchise. Now, this was like a couple of years before the Rams ended up moving to St. Louis, because they had just broke ground on what would be the Edward Jones Dome a couple of months before Jacksonville was awarded the franchise. But they still went ahead and built the dome in St. Louis in hopes of luring in a present NFL team. St. Louis is in the running for a team, as well as Baltimore, as well as Memphis. They were all in the running for an NFL team, which eventually, all except Memphis, got a team, but Memphis did have the Oilers for a year. So the Jaguars were essentially built through the draft again. Built through the draft. Tony Baselli was the number one pick overall from USC, one of the best offensive linemen in college football at the time. In fact, the best offensive lineman at the time. And we're going to have his number retired and end up in Canton as the first member of the Jaguars to reach the Hall of Fame.
Correct. And I mean, it was just a great pick, tremendous offensive tackle, and kind of, gets lost in the shuffle a bit because, he had some injury problems and his career was probably a bit short. So he didn't have quite the longevity that they would normally have. And then also to your point in terms of the awarding question for you, I know you mentioned over St. Louis, Baltimore, and Memphis. I know they were referring to St. Louis as breaking ground on the Edward Jones Dome, but they had just lost the Cardinals like a few years before then. So how would they be right back in the mix for an expansion team when you just lost the Cardinals? Because I want to say, what was it? Excuse me, the end of the '80s. Sorry. See, I'm suiting up like Cal Ripken today. I'm not 100%, but I'm suiting up. But anyway, they had voted in the late '80s to head out to Phoenix, so they had just lost the St. Louis Football Cardinals.
Right. Well, it was all of that was Bill Bidwell. Bill Bidwell had been pushing the city of St. Louis to build him a new stadium, and they were dragging their feet on it and everything. And Bill Bidwell left and of course seeks legal approval and moved his team to Phoenix. And you're right, it was just a few years later that they were in the running again to try to get an NFL team. And I think the NFL was somewhat skittish of putting a team back in St. Louis. So they decided, okay, we've had a team in St. Louis for forever. Since 1960, they moved from Chicago to St. Louis, the Cardinals did. And so they decided to, I guess, go with Jacksonville, because I guess what happened was they saw the amount of attendance that the Jacksonville Bulls were having in the USFL, leading for 2 years, led that league in attendance. And then St. Louis, who really over the years, of course, they really didn't have much to cheer for with the Cardinals, reaching the playoffs like 3 times in 28 years, when they were in St. Louis 2 years in the mid '70s and once in the strike shortened '82 season. That's the only time they had ever made the playoffs. And the years prior to that, you really couldn't give tickets away in St. Louis. So I think that's the main reason why they chose Jacksonville over St. Louis, was because they knew that the fans were going to come out in Jacksonville. They weren't really sure, I don't think, having that of the attendance that Jacksonville would have. They really weren't sure they were going to have that in St. Louis.
Correct, and that's a good point, because if you're not willing to come out to see Neil Lomax, the Roy Green each Sunday,
exactly,
I don't know what to tell you. If they couldn't draw you to the ballpark, and like J.T. Smith, Stump Mitchell, Otis Anderson, and all those guys, they had a lot of good players. And
Nico Noga
hell.
Exactly, Nico Noga along the defensive line. Had a couple of really good defensive players. Freddie Joe Nunn. Exactly. I mean, they had some players up there in St. Louis, but they were just in the division with the Redskins and the Cowboys and the Giants and the Eagles, and they were just outmatched, except through the mid '70s when they had Don Coryell as coach and Jim Lee Hart as quarterback.
And Dan Dierdorf.
And Terry Metcalf, one of the best running backs of the '70s you never hear about, So, and
correct.
Going back to Jacksonville, in the expansion draft, I noticed Steve Berline that they acquired from the Cowboys, and also Heisman Trophy winner Desmond Howard, who would go on to who would go on to Super Bowl win MVP of Super Bowl 31, which we kind of would touch on a little bit later. But their first head coach was a guy by the name of Tom Coughlin, would be the Jaguars' very first head coach. And I think that this was like the beginning of his rise to being, because he had became famous a year before of beating Notre Dame. He was the head coach of Boston College. They upset Notre Dame. The week after, they had beat Charlie Ward and Florida State in the quote unquote game of the century, the seventh game of the century in college football. So anyway, that's just a little bit of a digression there. But yeah, this is the seventh
Correct.
game of the century in college football, whereas in college basketball, there's only one game of the century. But anyway, enough about that. But yeah, the Jaguars essentially was built through the draft. And taking a look, before we get into the 95 season, Chuck, let's take a look at some of the guys that was on the inaugural teams of the Panthers. Just some guys that we all know about, and some guys that that you were like, okay, why is he still playing? Or just giving everybody an example of the types of players that these two franchises got in the beginning, in their first 2 years of playing in the National Football League.
Correct. Like, speaking of the expansion draft, they hit Jaguars kind of hit pretty good because they had, as you mentioned before, mentioned Steve Berline. They had Reggie Cobb from the running back from Green Bay. I know he was in Tampa prior to that. I think Derek Brown, who was a very solid tight end for the Giants. And then they also had Kelvin Martin, who had a few very productive years in that bridge of time in that Jimmy Johnson, Eric Cowboys before, going from that 1-15 team to going into developing into a Super Bowl dynasty type of team. And then you mentioned from the draft standpoint, they had Baselli, they had James Stewart, great running back at Tennessee, Chris Hudson, who was a solid safety, used to play at Colorado, and then Rob Johnson.
Yep.
To throw it out of the yard, but I always wanted to surf, man. He just from USC. But then speaking of the expansion draft, man, they had some decent players in here, man. They had some guys, let's see, let's look and see. They Kelvin Martin, he was a solid player.
Yep.
They had Desmond Howard, who wound up going ironically to the Packers, and going to the Packers and mentioning he won Super Bowl MVP. Then you just have like some of these cast-offs, man. Look at these dudes, man. Like they got John Duff, man. He doesn't even John Duff from the defensive end from the LA Raiders, Al Jackson, DB of the Philadelphia Eagles. Man, these dudes don't even have a Wikipedia page, man. So that tell you that these dudes were trash, man. Dude don't even have a Wikipedia page, man. And it's just like, so really they just had a bunch of cast-offs. But I think to your point in terms of the Jaguars, they smartly more so relied on the draft and player development, cultivation of young talent, as opposed to the Panthers. So we switch over to the Panthers. They had some notable guys too. The Panthers, they like you mentioned, it was more of a veteran-laden ball club. They had Tim McKyer from the Steelers. He'll pass his prime then because he was a very good player with the San Francisco 49ers. Then Howard Griffin, who was the fullback of the LA Rams at the time.
Yep.
Why is he a notable name? Because he would go on to pave the way for Terrell Davis Hall of Fame bids, as well as the 2,000-yard season, an MVP, and a pair of Super Bowls. You had Mark Carrier. You had quarterback Doug Peterson. He wasn't nothing as a player, but he's been a good coach, Super Bowl winning coach, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
Then these are two names, two bums here, man. Like Jack Trudeau, man, from the New York Jets, man. He
Indianapolis Colts. I remember him with the Colts
quarterback. Yeah. But he was garbage in Tecmo Bowl, man. He lost me $50 once because I had him and I was up. I needed a touchdown to win. the dude called the run play. I called the pass play. Everybody was wide open, man. So I threw it with Jack Trudeau. The ball took so long to come down. My friend, his player, he ran from the line of scrimmage all the way to all the way to the end zone and picked it off. And I lost the game and lost $50. And you know how I am about losing.
Oh
I
wow!
proceeded to tab everything in the room. So I'm like Jack Trudeau. The only quarterback that was worse than Jack Trudeau in Super Bowl was Steve Grogan, man. Now he was
Wow!
garbage, man. But and then, but speaking of the Carolina Panthers, man, this is a name people may know of. Bill Goldberg. Yes,
That's right.
Bill Goldberg.
That Bill Goldberg, right?
Champion Bill Goldberg. The spear. The man that kicked Bret Hart in the face and ended his career. That Bill Goldberg. He watched out the excellence of execution, like in wrestling, not to digress too far. He's supposed to be safe, but he was always an unsafe guy. He kicked Bret Hart dead in the face, and the excellence of execution cut his career short. And Bret Hart hates him to this day for that. And then, those are some guys, and that's before the aforementioned quartet of Bill players. And then as far as the draft is concerned, they drafted Kerry Collins, quarterback, Penn State, Tyrone Poole, cornerback, who was solid.
Yep.
And then they drafted Blake Brockermeyer, who was had an adequate NFL career as well.
All right. The Panthers, let's start off with the 1995 season. Matter of fact, they played each other in the Hall of Fame game. I remember watching the Hall of Fame game in Canton, the very first preseason game that opened up the NFL preseason schedule. And I remember watching that game, and I'll never forget, my grandfather walked into the room, and he sat down, and he looked at the game, and he was like, since when did we start getting Canadian football? He thought these were two Canadian teams. And I'm like, no, this is the NFL. I was like, no, Granddad, this is the NFL. Like, who are these people? The Panthers? And they showed the score, Carolina Panthers, Jacksonville Jaguars. It's like, when did they come from? It's like, but they're new. They're two expansion teams. He's like, wow. I did not know the NFL had added teams or whatever. So he thought they were two Canadian teams. Okay. Start off with the Panthers. The Panthers would start off like a shot. Okay. They finished the year, the 1995 season, 7-9, which for most teams, 7-9, 2 games under 500. All right, I guess it was, we need to make some improvement. But for an expansion team, that was huge. Most wins by an expansion team in NFL history, going 7-9. And these are some notes about the 95 team. First team to have a winning record at home, 5-3. Most wins by an expansion team. First expansion team with a 4-game winning streak. And the first expansion team ever to win to beat the Super Bowl champion in their first year. That year, the defending Super Bowl champion was the 49ers. The year after, they crushed my Chargers. And they not only beat the 49ers, they beat them at Candlestick, late in the year. So that was like a really, really, really impressive thing. Just to look over their first season. They played their home games at Clemson because Ericsson Stadium, which you now know of as Bank of America Stadium, that was still under construction. Okay, so they were playing their games at Clemson, South Carolina. And I think that was by design because, their games are going to be in Charlotte, but at the same time, playing their games at Memorial Stadium at Clemson would give them, is in the name, the Carolina Panthers, to give the people from South Carolina a little bit of, we got a hand in this too kind of deal. And they played their home games at Clemson Stadium, at Memorial Stadium at Clemson, and they were 5-3 at home. They didn't win their first game, however, until October the 15th by beating the New York Jets 26-15. The game-winning play was a defensive play by none other than Sam Mills. Jets quarterback Bubby Brister tried to throw a shuffle pass, into the line, which was intercepted by Sam Mills, and Sam Mills ran it back 30 yards for a touchdown to seal the win over the New York Jets. Hence the name Bubby Brister. Everybody knows that name from the 90s. You know, also, and then they had a 4-game winning streak. Like I said, they had a 4-game winning streak, including beating the San Francisco 49ers 13-7 at Candlestick. And in that game, Tim McKyer, the former 49er, had a 96-yard touchdown interception return for a touchdown in that game to sting his old team, to give them the win over the 49ers. Kerry Collins was the starter for most of the year, throwing for 2,700 yards, 14 touchdowns, but he had 19 picks. Okay, but he started 13 games. Derek Moore led the team in rushing for 740 yards on the ground. Mark Carrier from Church Point, Louisiana, 66 receptions for 1,002 yards and 3 touchdowns. And Willie Green, the former Lions receiver, 47 receptions for 882 yards, and led the team with 6 touchdown receptions. So all in all, for an expansion team to go in their first year, go 7-9, and they finished 4th in the division. I think they finished tied with both. I think they finished tied. If I'm not mistaken, they finished tied with They finished tied with the Saints and the Falcons in that division, because you got to remember the 49ers were in that division, as well as the then Los Angeles Rams. They were all jumbled together in the NFC West, which geographically makes absolutely no sense. But that was the way the NFL was back in the mid-1990s. But that first 1995 season for the Panthers, hey, we may have something in Charlotte. At least that's what a lot of people were thinking.
Yes, did a very good job, because as we mentioned earlier, you detailed the 4-game win streak. They started out 0-5, and then before improving to 1-6, and then wound up 7-9, which they went on the run. And as you mentioned, Forrest mentioned Sam Mills, which I'll get to in just a moment when we talk about the 96 season, because only the Saints would do stuff like this. But anyway, I'll get to that in a moment. He was a catalyst, so you could see from the top down, they had Bill Polian, Don Capers. They brought in a lot of veterans, including Sam Mills. So they tried to establish a lot of players that had experienced success in NFL, not only on an individual level, but from a team standpoint as well. Try to establish a winning culture in there, and it seemingly took off. They got their wheels under them relatively quickly to have a strong 7-9 finish in their inaugural season.
Yeah, one thing I remember about that team was that a lot of people were just kind of like discounting them. It's like, I think the main thing that I remember about that 95 season was that a lot of the NFL quote unquote pundits were kind of discounting them because, it's like the NFL for most part is built totally different from other leagues, where it is very possible for a team to literally come out of nowhere, take advantage of certain schedule quirks or whatever, and have one of those seasons that just like confounds the experts. And basically, they were sneaking up on people. That's what a lot of pundits were saying. They were just kind of sneaking up on everybody. They were kind of taking them lightly. You have all of these veteran players who got chemistry right away, but they kind of snuck up on people. This was an anomaly. This was something that you're not going to see all the time, especially what was going on with the Jaguars in the AFC. While Carolina was having some success, not so much for the Jacksonville Jaguars, because they started off their first season, they went 4-12, which was kind of like what everybody expected what everybody was expecting the Panthers to do. But conversely, before we even get to the Jags, they were there's something going on with this team that we're not expecting. But at the same time, I think the pundits were very dismissive because of, maybe they're just sneaking up on people. They're taking them lightly. Now, wait till next year. Then you're really going to see what the Panthers are really about, because they're probably going to go 4-12 or 3-13 or that kind of thing.
Yes, but then the very good thing that they did was they controlled the controllables. That's what they did. They showed up each week to play. They played a full 60 minutes each week and then just let the chips fall where they may.
That's
You
exactly
know, and a
right.
lot of times, they showed up to play each week. Wherever the chips fall, they fall. And they got off to a slow start and finished strong. They finished 7-9, like whether or not they didn't concern themselves with whether or not they were being overlooked, what the pundits had to say, what the opponents, whether or not they were dismissive or not. If you want to be dismissive, cool. Thank you very much. We'll take that because that makes our job of trying to win a ball game on Sundays easier. So thank you. And they just showed up to play with that old Dom Capers toughness, and a lot of those Grizzly veterans held a lot of those guys accountable. And to your point, they develop a cohesion relatively quickly, and they were able to kind of do some very positive things out there.
Now, when you talk about that first year, you mentioned Dom Capers, and Dom Capers was the defensive guru for the Steelers, and he had that great zone blitz package that they had with the Steelers and things of that nature. But he was also a very understated, very reserved coach. I don't ever remember him like really going off on a ref or going off on a player on the sidelines or anything like that. He was very understated, very calm, he was basically in total contrast to what Tom Coughlin was. Tom Coughlin had Coughlin time, if you remember. If you were 5 minutes to a meeting, if you were there 5 minutes early to a meeting, you were late. So but Dom Capers was, I think, the perfect coach for that team with all of those veterans. Yeah, you had a young quarterback in Kerry Collins, but you had a veteran group nucleus of that Panther team that saw, hey, we got something here. We're doing something right. We're 7-9, finished out that first year. We can only go up from here. And they never really, and you're right, they never really concerned themselves with like what all of the outside noise that they say. They were very concerned with, okay, this is what's going on in here. This is who we playing next week. And to Dom Capers' leadership and to the leadership of the other players on the team, that's pretty much what kept that team going. And what made that team's early success was the bedrock of that team's early success in the NFL.
Correct. And then you also have to factor in as well that since Dom Capers, he was kind of like in the early stages of the dividends of devising that zone blitz scheme. It was kind of a relatively new thing because you remember before that, it was simply where, quarterback, he didn't necessarily have to know his hot read. You blitz the quarterback, you just throw the ball from wherever which the pressure came, and usually
right.
your open receiver is there, your relief is there. Whereas when Dom Capers devised that zone blitz scheme, that flipped that approach on his head because he may line up like he's going to bring 6, he'll bring 4. Then you think the pressure comes from one place, the linebacker safety comes off the edge. You go to release it where the pressure came from. You don't account for the fact that defensive end dropped in that spot that the safety blitz from. Pick 6, easy. So it took a time. Right. And I just said all of that to say that with the veteran ball club and the success that the zone blitz scheme had up to that point, I don't think, especially from a defensive standpoint, that it was very hard to attain buy-in because the scheme, his scheme, his schematics were proven to work. And if the players embraced the scheme and didn't make mistakes, they would have some success. And then back then, this was football before they opened all the rules up now, where you could still win. Like you mentioned, Kerry Collins had 19 interceptions, but despite the 19 interceptions, just don't lose the ball game. You just don't make the debilitating plays to lose the game for us. Our defense will keep us in it, and then we bang away for 60 minutes, wear down the other team on both sides of the line of scrimmage. We may be able to steal the game at the end, which they were beginning to be able to do consistently.
Now, moving on to the Jacksonville season of 1995, like I mentioned, they finished 4-12, and they pretty much played like an expansion team, you expected a young expansion team to play. But they kind of finished kind of on a roll to finish that year. They won their first game by beating the Oilers. Show you how long ago this was. They beat the Oilers in the Astrodome 17-16 on a late game field goal. Then they won their second game, which was their very first win in the brand new refurbished Gator Bowl, back then known as Jacksonville Municipal Stadium. They beat the Steelers 20-16, which that year they were on their way to the Super Bowl. And then residing in the AFC Central, I should say, they swept the Browns in the season series. They played the Browns twice, beat the Browns once in Cleveland and then once in Jacksonville. Steve Berline was the starting quarterback of the year, but he gave the reins over. Tom Coughlin decided, okay, Steve, you're good, but we got some guy behind you that I think may be a little bit better. The guy from the University of Washington named Mark Brunell, who is still beloved in Jacksonville. When I still think of the Jacksonville Jaguars, he's one of the first people I think of is Mark Brunell. That year, his first season with the Jags, he was backup for Brett Favre in Green Bay. And of course, he wasn't going to see any time behind Brett Favre. I mean, let's be real.
No.
Mark Brunell finished the 1995 season 2,168 yards passing, 15 touchdowns against only 2 interceptions. Okay, James Stewart led the team in rushing with 525 yards rushing and 2 touchdowns. Mark Brunell also had 480 yards rushing. So he was like a dual threat quarterback, in the 90s when dual threat quarterbacks were still somewhat kind of rare. And he used his legs a lot, and he got the Jags in future years would get out of trouble for the Jags, with his legs as well as his left arm.
Correct. And he was kind of like a poor man Steve Young.
Yeah, he was.
Time, like he had a lot of similar attributes, both left-handed, both
That's right.
Had high accuracy, both had mobility, both could really run that West Coast scheme very well, and both were proven winners. Steve at BYU, Brunell, he shared time with, get this name, Billy Joe Holbert.
That's right.
They split time on that 1991 Washington Husky team that split the national championship with the Miami Hurricanes that year, beating Michigan in the Rose Bowl that year. Mm-hmm.
But the leading receiver that year, Willie Jackson, 53 receptions for 589 yards and 5 touchdowns. And if you notice, the stats are kind of like, it's nowhere near what you would see today. Plus it was a 4-12 team, first year expansion, just getting their feet wet in the AFC. Now, at that time, Chuck, who you think was it was still the AFC, the NFC's dominance in the Super Bowl, with them winning eventually 18 consecutive Super Bowls, the NFC did over the AFC. But this was like right at the beginning of the AFC getting a little bit better over time, becoming a little bit more competitive as far as like good teams. They had more good teams in the AFC in 1995 than you would consider the NFC. Because let's think about it. Okay, the 49ers were on their way down. You had the Bears were, I'm talking about the traditional powers. The Giants were middling along. The Cowboys were in their heyday, but they were kind of the decline a little bit. The 49ers were kind of like on the decline as well. With the AFC, you had teams like the Denver Broncos that was on the way up. You had the Pittsburgh Steelers that were already there. You started hearing a little bit of noise from the Kansas City Chiefs, with Marty Schottenheimer. I think Marty Schottenheimer was the coach at that point, if I'm not mistaken, during the time in the mid-90s.
He was.
Then you had, the Miami Dolphins were up there with Shula and Marino. They were up there. The Buffalo Bills, of course, went to 4 Super Bowls, but they kind of were on their way down. But this was kind of like the turning of the passing of the torch, so to speak, in the NFL with it, but everything was kind of like starting to become more in flux as far as like what team or what conference was going to be dominant. And that was kind of like the beginning of, a little bit of upheaval in the NFL in the mid 1990s.
Yes, and you have to attribute that to a couple of things. I'm sorry, changes in the style of play. Because
Yeah.
whereas in the 80s, predominantly AFC teams were high flying. Dan Fouts and the Chargers, Marino and the Dolphins, Ken O'Brien and the Jets,
That's right.
even like Kenny Anderson and Boomer Esiason both with the Bengals to an extent. High flying offenses, fast paced, and things like that. Whereas, like at the influx of the 90s, the AFC slowly began to become more and more trench focused on both sides of the ball, more defensive focus, more stopping that run focus, like the influx of Bill Cowher with the Steelers and so forth. Then another huge factor as well, in my opinion, it was the introduction of the hard cap in the middle of the 90s. Remember?
That's right.
Because
Yeah.
you remember before that, all teams would do, like the predominant powers that you spoke of beforehand, all they would do, everybody would obviously want to play for those teams, and free agency players didn't bounce around like they do now. But what they could do is the Niners did in '94, for example. They had a host of great players: Ricky Jackson, Gary Plummer. They got Deion Sanders. They got Tim McDonald. They got all those guys, and they were all able to fit them all under the cap because what they would do was the signing bonuses wouldn't count against the cap. Like, the cap was a certain amount. They'll pay Ricky Jackson like $100,000. Then the signing bonus is $1.5 million. So you could still get the player, but the bonus didn't count against the cap at that time. But then by this time, they had begun to institute the hard cap where all monies counted against the cap. And then that's when you started seeing, like, in addition to the expansion, which spread out the talent a little bit more, as well as the hard cap, it dispersed that talent a bit more evenly, and that's how come you started to see some of those declines in perennial powers like the Skins, teams like that.
Right. Moving on to 1996, and this is the season before their first year. Carolina, most wins ever by an expansion team. Finished 7-9, 2 games below 500. Meanwhile, the Jags finished 4-12. Typical expansion, mark, kind of figure. But 1995, new season. Now we're going to see, okay, are the Carolina Panthers really that good? And on the other side, can Jacksonville improve? But boy, did they improve. First of all, let's start off with the 96 Panthers. Talk about them. They went from 7-9 in 1995 to 12-4 and the division title the next year, which shocked the world, including yours truly. They made the playoffs for the first time, and they had key additions. They got Steve Berline, who was with the Jags the year before. Now he's the backup quarterback to Kerry Collins in Charlotte, in Carolina. They also got Dwayne Bickett from the Seahawks, a linebacker. Very good linebacker, very solid linebacker. They also got Eric Davis from the 49ers, part of those world champion 49er teams, in the early 90s. But they also got the prize student of Dom Capers from the Pittsburgh Steelers, linebacker Kevin Green, which is one of the most underrated linebackers I've ever seen. And when you talk about best linebackers of the 90s, you have to say Junior Seau, and you also have to say Kevin Green. Two of the best linebackers in the AFC during the 1990s. And by the way, from the New Orleans Saints, they picked Wesley Walls at tight end, which would become a key factor for their offense as the season would progress.
Correct. And they just, to your point, they just had these free agent additions, and they just, a lot of times for a team to really hit pay dirt, it requires a lot of luck. And they just, everything they hit on in that 96 free agent class, they hit a home run. Because in addition to that, they had Greg Skrapinack from the Raiders.
Yeah.
and Lamar Lathan from the
Oilers.
Oilers, and
Yeah.
of course Wesley Walls. Of course Wesley Walls. So now they got two Saints. Wesley Walls, I guess he was tired. That was at the time when the Saints had the Billy Joe Tolliver
And Billy
and
Joe
Billy
Holbert.
Joe Holbert.
Yeah.
If you don't have you got two starting quarterbacks, you don't have any. He left.
Right.
Then you got Sam Mills in there. They're good, and they just hit home runs on all of this. And speaking of Kevin Green, he was familiar with the Caper zone blitz scheme from the time together in Pittsburgh. And even before that, he was just always a guy that played with like his hair was on fire. He just
Yes,
played
right.
like his hair was on fire at
And
all
long
times.
and long hair at that.
Whistle.
Yeah.
Yeah, correct. And he just always, and that type of thing and accountability is infectious because when you got a guy like that in your locker room that plays from Wilson to Wilson that hard, he tells you to get off your butt and get to it. You tend to listen because
Right.
you look at the example that he sets.
Exactly. Also in the draft, their draft was pretty good too. Running back Tim Biakabatuka from the University of Michigan, which was one of the best collegiate running backs at the time, from the University of Michigan. But they also got a receiver named Mushin Muhammad, who would play for the Panthers forever. In fact, when the Panthers reached Super Bowl XXXIX, I think he was like one of the last members of this 95 team to be still playing for the Panthers when they finally reached the Super Bowl, when they had Jake Delhomme, leading them to arguably, I think, one of the best Super Bowls no one remembers because of what happened at halftime of that game. But anyway, I digress. But also they picked up Winslow Oliver in the draft from New Mexico, a third-round draft pick, which was a running back, which was another really good running back. A lot of people don't remember Winslow Oliver, but I do because I remember one game Winslow Oliver just tore up BYU in a Mountain West. I only think it was Mountain West. I think it was still the WAC back then. But he tore up BYU one night for like 290 some yards rushing, when he was at New Mexico. So you have Tim Biakabatuka, Mushin Muhammad, and Winslow Oliver adding to the veteran-laden team. And also you have Kerry Collins, a young quarterback who's starting to find his own, as a second-year quarterback for this. You really can't say expansion anymore because this is a team that's really starting to, kick butt and take names now, because this is a team that, okay, maybe they really have something here in Charlotte, in the Carolina Panthers.
Yes, and very important, and I think most important is they set him up for success because like a lot of times these teams don't set these quarterbacks up for success. They already had a solid defense from the year before. They needed a little bit more pass rush and playmaking. What do? They go out and get Dwayne Bickett and Kelvin Green. They get Eric Davis, who had some experience generating turnovers and winning that Super Bowl with the Niners. Then need to limit turnovers on offense. What you do? Get them a big security blanket and Wesley Walls tight end, then a big body receiver in the aforementioned Mushin Muhammad. That way, he can give him things to work with that can kind of keep him from mistakes and all of that. Which in this era, because for our listeners, it was a quarterback driven league, but you could still win back then if your quarterback if you had an adequate quarterback, above average, but didn't turn the ball over a lot. If your defense and running game was good enough, you could still be Super Bowl contenders back then. Whereas now, if you don't have a playmaking quarterback, you don't have a chance because now the defense plays with one hand tied behind their back. Whereas back in this era that we're covering right now, other than tripping and clotheslining, everything else was
pretty much legal,
pretty
right?
much other than that.
Okay.
So, yes.
So the Panthers start off the 1996 season winning their first 3 games. They started 3-0, to start the year. Like, okay, 3-0 start, hey, what's going on here? Then they slide a little. They go 2-4. Okay, doing a stretch of 6 games, they go 2-4. And at this point, they're 5-4, kind of languishing within the NFC West. Okay, then all of a sudden they turn it on. They win 7 straight
They sweep the 49ers, Saints, and Rams in the division. Okay. In fact, we talked about how good the 49ers, and everybody remembers how good the 49ers were. In the first two seasons, the Panthers had beaten the 49ers 3 times out of 4, which really shocked a lot of people. They finished the year 12-4. They win their first ever division title and make the playoffs for the first time. And they win this, and they win the division essentially going away. So it makes a lot of people think, wait a minute, okay, these Carolina Panthers are for real. I remember watching Chris Berman on NFL Primetime, and every week he would say the same thing, doing this 7-game winning streak. The Carolina Panthers are for real. Every week, the same thing. The Carolina Panthers are for real. And I used to laugh at that, you know. Like, Tom, one more time. Tom, the Carolina Panthers are for real.
Yes.
They're playing.
Yes.
They are a new juggernaut here in the NFL. And I used to be cracking up at that because nobody expected this. And it's a second-year expansion team not only making the playoff, but and people were like trying to look and see, like, how did they build this team? What did they do? Going through free agency. Why don't we do that? You know, other teams. You know, but like you said, they picked a bunch of guys, and a lot of the guys that they picked were home runs for the Carolina Panthers in that year of 1996. They were just completely turn the NFL on its head as far like how you build an expansion team. Okay, they finished tied with the 49ers in the standings. They both finished 12-4 that year. But by virtue of the Panthers beating the 49ers twice, they were awarded the NFC West Championship, their first ever division title in franchise history. And what happens? They have a first round bye. Not only did they make the playoff, they had a first round bye. Okay. They were the number 2 seed in the NFC that year behind the Green Bay Packers. And so on January 5th, 1997, they played the very first playoff game against, of all people, the Dallas Cowboys, the defending Super Bowl champions. And the game is in Charlotte, in brand new Ericsson Stadium. And I remember watching this game, and the first thing I said when I saw the television screen, the Cowboys are going to lose. You know why they're going to lose? They were wearing blue. Anytime, if you are a football fan from way back, there's this urban legend, this urban myth that every time the Cowboys wear blue in a playoff game, they always lose. And when I saw that, I was like, bro, the Panthers are going to win this game because the Dallas Cowboys never win wearing blue. Never. And sure enough, that's exactly what happened.
Correct. Lost 26-17, and it kind of, you know, as you mentioned, the Cowboys, even though they won the Super Bowl the year before and three of the last 4 years, they were kind of in decline because this was the second year post Jerry Jones, Jimmy Johnson fallout. Barry Switzer was now coach. They kind of won the Super Bowl the year before in spite of him.
Right.
And now it's kind of like, you know, they're aging, they're older in the Panthers. They just kind of came into that, had 2 weeks to get ready, and they just came in firing on all cylinders and dismounted them 26-17 in the divisional round, advancing to the NFC title game.
If you remember the game, the one thing that I remember, and I remember this after I researched it, but I kind of forgot it. The second play of the game, Michael Irvin got knocked out of the game by Lamar Latham when he broke his collarbone. And when I saw that, I was like, oh my God, Michael Irvin's gone. I'm like, bro, Carolina may have this. Sure enough, for his 3 interceptions by Troy Aikman, Kerry Collins passed for 2 touchdowns. Anthony Johnson ran for 104 yards, the running back for the Panthers, ran for 104 yards. John Casey hit 4 field goals, and the Cowboys defeated the defending Super Bowl champs 26-17 and moved on to the NFC Championship game at Green Bay the next week. And I was just sit there in total awe. I remember watching this game with my grandpa, my aforementioned grandfather, and he was so happy about the Panthers. He hated the Cowboys. But he was like, I don't believe that an expansion team has a chance to go to the Super Bowl. What is the world coming to? And that's what I think a lot of people around the country were like, who the heck are the Carolina Panthers? But a lot of people are still getting over what had happened the day before, which we're about to get into in a bit. But the Panthers, one win away from the Super Bowl, an expansion team that no one had heard of prior to 2 years before. I mean, this is something very special happening in the NFL right at this point.
Correct. And I mean, they came out and they established the tone early. They, you don't want nobody to get injured, but they injured him, Michael Irvin, on the second play of the game. They let the Cowboys know we hitting out here today, baby.
Exactly.
Gotta play some ball, and they just kind of, back then, the most physical team wins, and they just were very physical that game. They just dominated both sides of the line of scrimmage, shut down Emmitt Smith, and contained the best they could, and forced Troy Aikman into turnovers. And then to your point earlier, with Anthony Johnson, they was able to run the football and keep the pressure off Kerry Collins, where he only had to kind of make the timely plays as opposed to trying to having to carry the pail of water for the entirety of the 60 minutes.
Now we have the Carolina Panthers in the NFC Championship game. Moving on to the 1996 Jacksonville Jaguars over in the AFC. They were coming off of a 4-12 season. Not too much was expected of them. They're playing in the AFC Central with the likes of the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Cincinnati Bengals and the Cleveland Browns and the Houston Oilers. Okay, they're coming off of a 4-12 season, and of course they start off kind of slow. They start off 3-6, had a 3-game losing streak. But then something happened, and the switch just turned on by a key loss, which turned their season around. But before we get into that, their key additions that year, and this broke my heart. Natrone Means leaves the Chargers to go to Jacksonville. I was so mad that Natrone Means left, because he got into it with management in San Diego, and it was not really it was an ugly situation in San Diego. And for what I read about it later, I really didn't blame him for leaving because they tried to screw him over. Okay, another person that they got, Eddie Robinson, linebacker from the Houston Oilers, but they also got a wide receiver from the Cleveland Browns named Keenan McCardell, which he would figure later into the history of this franchise in a big, big way. But also they got a veteran defensive leader in Clyde Simmons, most notably from the Philadelphia Eagles. He came from the Arizona Cardinals to shore up that defensive front of Jacksonville. But like I said, there was a key turnaround of the season, and it happened in Week 8 against the newly minted St. Louis Rams in St. Louis. They ended up losing the game 17-14. But even though Mark Brunell threw for 421 yards in that game, he threw 5 interceptions. And in that game, they decided to demote their starting main wide receiver, which was Andre Rison, and replace him with a guy named Jimmy Smith. That pretty much set the table for one of the best pass receiving tandems in the 90s, Keenan McCardell and Jimmy Smith in Jacksonville. And that pretty much caused a chain reaction. And then they ended up winning 6 of their last 7 games to reach the end, to become a wild card team. The season came down to the very last game of the season against the Atlanta Falcons, which I'm going to get into in a second. But I'll give you a chance to weigh in on the 1996 Jaguars and what happened to that team during that year.
Man, it's just a remarkable turnaround, and spearheaded by Natrone Means Business.
That's right.
And of course the Chargers, they're just the Chargers are going to find a way to be the Chargers. You know, they
Yep, of
just
course.
always trying to get labor. They always trying to get $1 million output for pennies on the dollar at all
Yep.
times. But and then another addition was defensive tackle John Jerkovich from the Packers.
Yeah.
He was like with Natron Mees was able to come in there and establish that run. Jerkovich kind of helped with the combination of he and Eddie Robinson kind of become much more formidable against the run and all of that. And then they also, to your point, you mentioned Keenan McCardell. He was a good player with the Browns, and the elevation of Jimmy Smith. They both of them wound up having the first of many tandem 1,000-yard seasons apiece. And for a while they were probably maybe outside of Rice and Taylor, they were probably the best thing going as far as wide receiver duos. And then, of course, Brunell coming into his own, and they just, and, the Coughlin buy-in, he just, he get on your nerves and he may grind your gears. But one thing he's able to do is churn out winning teams and solid teams and all of that. So they finished 9-7 and then made the way to the playoffs. And then to your point, despite the 9-7 record, more importantly, they were playing their best ball at the right time. They were clicking on all cylinders at the right time, pretty much.
It came down to the last game of the 1996 season for the Jacksonville Jaguars. They had to win their last game. If they lost their last game, which took place 3 days before Christmas, on December 22nd, 1996, home game against the Atlanta Falcons. They lose the game, they're out the playoff. But if they win the game, they're in. Okay, it was that simple for them. They fall behind. They come back. They take the lead over the Falcons, 19-17, right, with a late touchdown to Jimmy Smith. Falcons get the ball back with some time left. They drive down the field and the Falcons get into field goal range with Mr. Automatic Martin Anderson. Martin Anderson gets it, snap, kick, and the ball, as soon as he kicks it, he knows it's off. It's not only off, it's way off. Jacksonville wins the game. They earn a playoff spot for the first time in franchise history. They still play, and it just seemed like week after week after week, they found a way to win games, which is the Coughlin way. They found a way to win. So the next week, they go to Buffalo for the wild card game against the Buffalo Bills. Not only did they have to deal with the Buffalo Bills, perennial playoff team, they sorted down a little bit. Nobody really knew that this was going to be Jim Kelly's last game. The Buffalo, not only had to face the Buffalo Bills, but Jacksonville had to face off against history. Up to that point, the Buffalo Bills had never lost a home playoff game. Never. In the history of the franchise, they had never lost a playoff game, going all the way back to the 1960s when they were in the AFL playing at War Memorial Stadium and the Rock Pile. They had never lost a home playoff game. And they certainly had never lost a home playoff game at Rich Stadium with Jim Kelly at quarterback. But what happens? Jacksonville scores 10 unanswered points in the fourth quarter, thanks to Natron Means running all over the Bills' offense, and a late Mike Hollis field goal to make the score 30-27, claiming Jacksonville's first ever playoff win. Okay, and it pretty much, like, Jacksonville up to that point was pretty much flying under the radar all season long. But within beating Buffalo, people were like, okay, Jacksonville is in the playoffs and they beat the Buffalo Bills. Like, who are these people? You got Carolina on one side, then you got Jacksonville. People were like asking themselves, like, okay, who are these people? Okay, I know I was, So they win the game. Natron Means has a big day. Brunell has a big day. They dethrone the Buffalo Bills, and their reward to take on the best team in the NFL that very next week in Denver against the Denver Broncos.
Yes, and then just to revisit that game, as far as the Bills and Jaguars were concerned, all of these big days, the main catalyst for that was just it was a hyped up matchup between the young tackle Tony Baselli versus the old veteran All-Pro, perennial
Bruce,
All-Pro
Bruce Smith.
and Tony Baselli just dominated the matchup. And, throughout the game, Bruce Smith complaining about holds and things like this. And some of that is probably true. But, you and I know from competing, when the other dudes start whining to the ref, you're like, we got him. We got him for sure now. And they just, once again, they went in there and just took that game away from the Bills and, an unexpected victory. And then to your point, leading into the game versus the Denver Broncos, which nobody gave them a chance of because they went into the game as 2-touchdown underdogs because the Broncos had home field throughout the playoffs, were the best team in the league all season. And so they were like, okay, the Jaguars, who won the playoff game, made the playoffs. Nice year, but your season will be coming to an end in Denver next weekend. But somebody forgot to tell Tom Coughlin and the Jaguars, they forgot to send them the memo.
Yeah, one of the things about this game that we're about to talk about, Jacksonville at Denver, Saturday afternoon, January 4th, 1997, was the lead up into the game. And leading up to the game, there was this Denver Post writer by the name of Woody Page who wrote a column about the upcoming game. I have both read and written columns in my life, newspaper columns in my life. And throughout my 50 years of life, my 50 plus years of life, I have never read a column that was so dismissive and so disrespectful to a team ever in my life. Woody Page at the time of the Denver Post wrote a column, and the title of it was, "Yo Jags, it's time to hit the road, Jack." Now, I'm going to read a couple of excerpts from this, and you want to talk about disrespect. This takes it to a whole new level. He says, quote, "When did the NFL start letting USFL teams participate in the playoffs? Are the Jags from the Goofy World League or the Continental Basketball Association? How do you get worked up to play somebody called Jacksonville with a bunch of nobodies? Who wants to hurl insults and snowballs at the Jaguars?" Now, if I was a Jaguar player, I'm already hyped up for the game. But if Tom Coughlin would have put that on the bulletin board and said, "This is what the Denver writers think of you," I'd have been so hot, I would have been ready to play. I wouldn't need any more. That's all I needed right there. I have never, and those of you just look that up. Look up Woody Page, Jaguars column, and read the thing in its entirety. It is a piece of work. First of all, it's well written, but at the same time, it is the most disrespectful piece of literature I have ever read for a columnist to write about another team. I mean, Chuck, hearing that, that's just a couple of paragraphs. It goes on for much more than that. Saying that Jacksonville is the only city in Florida that don't have a beach. It said a whole bunch of different things, that are just like, are you kidding me? You actually wrote that and printed that? I mean, come on. I mean, it was a piece of work, Chuck, I tell you.
Of course, man. Everybody know, if I was a Jaguar, the first thing I say, man, Woody Page was sucker, but he just got a right.
Chuck, I know you,
stuff,
Chuck, I know you, and you wouldn't just say sucker. You would say a lot of other pointed comments. You wouldn't just say sucker. I know that.
And you already know me. I'd have called Woody by name. I would have. But yeah, man. But you can tell people that don't play. Man. Because what I know from competing and watching sports, man. Everybody always have a chance. Yep. Always. And, everyone always has a chance, man. And you cannot take anybody lightly, especially at the professional level, because, they are pro basketball. I mean, they're pro players. They probably were the best football players in their hometown. They were the better football players in their college town. And they're in the league. Everybody in the league to a degree, it's good, so you cannot underestimate anybody. And I don't know if it was underestimation or not, because, I think if I remember in that game correctly, in addition to that column, Denver jumped out on them fairly quickly, kind of making it look like what Woody Page had to say was probably was some truth to what he had to say then. And then, you never underestimate anyone, and you always play a full 60-minute ball game.
Right. It is considered, and I consider this the greatest NFL postseason upset of the decade of the 90s. It was bigger than the Chargers going to Pittsburgh and beating the Steelers in the AFC Championship game 2 years earlier. Jaguars was a 14, like you said, Jaguars 14-point underdogs. Okay, and the Broncos jumped out to a quick 12-0 lead, 2 touchdowns and 2 missed extra points. But you had Von Hebron with a 1-yard touchdown run, and then Shannon Sharp, an 18-yard touchdown pass from John Elway, and they went for 2. I'm going to take that back. They went for 2 and missed. So it was 12-0. But then in the second quarter, the Jags found their offense, scored 13 unanswered points to hold a 1-point lead, 13-12, heading into halftime. Natrone Means had an 8-yard touchdown run between 2 Mike Hollis field goals. Then in the third quarter, that's when you started to see Jacksonville start to dominate the game. Slow, methodical offense with the running of Natrone Means, the running and passing of Mark Brunell. One drive culminated with a 31-yard touchdown pass from Brunell to Keenan McCardle, to extend their lead to 20-12. And then in the fourth quarter, after Mike Hollis field goal, Terrell Davis had a 2-yard scoring play to make the score 23-20. And then the key drive of the game, which was, everybody remembers the long run by Mark Brunell, getting the ball deep into Denver territory, and then the next play, a 16-yard touchdown pass to Jimmy Smith in the corner of the end zone, diving out of bounds, making the catch with less than 4 minutes to play. Denver would score another touchdown pass to your boy, Ed McCaffrey, but they couldn't recover the onside kick. And the shocker of all shockers, Jaguars win 30-27 in Denver, shocking the world. And if I was a Denver player, I would not let Woody Page into the locker room. Get his story some other way. He ain't coming in this locker room. I would have been furious because you added fuel to the fire for what the Jaguars had. If you just kept your mouth shut, maybe, we could have had this. But Woody Page, I think, added a little bit more fuel to the fire by saying what he had to say during his little column thing. But Jags shocked the world, and then the next day, the Panthers shocked the world. And here you are going into the conference championship Sunday with 2 teams that just 16 months earlier didn't even exist, And I can remember a lot of people around the country were tuning in that never really watched football before, just to look at these guys, look at these 2 teams that they had never seen before. And can you imagine 2 expansion teams playing each other in the Super Bowl? Yo, we almost had it.
Okay, like you mentioned, you mentioned about Woody Page. Now, this is where you and I differ. Now, even though he shouldn't have gave them additional motivation and all of that, man, if you're the Broncos, you got to come in, you got to match that intensity, man. That has, that shouldn't have any bearing on you getting your butt kicked, man. You gotta match that intensity and all of that. Now, I still wouldn't let Woody in my locker room now, but I wouldn't let him in my locker room or anything like that. But yeah, they just took the game away from them because they jumped out 12-0, and then I'm pretty sure Shannon Sharp probably on the sideline trying to call the White House, please send the National Guard to come get the Jaguars. But then the Jaguars we not done just yet, man.
Yep.
We're gonna play, and then they just kind of control the line of scrimmage and just they controlled the line of scrimmage and just time of possession. Because if you look at it, Terrell Davis averaged 6.5 yards a carry. Broncos averaged 6 yards a carry, but it had very little bearing because, they only had 21 rushes, whereas conversely, the Jaguars had 36 rushes and averaged nearly 60 yards per carry themselves and for 203 yards. And then that along with timely passing and timely passing by Brunell and timely catches by Smith and McCardell, and even my man Pete Mitchell,
Yep.
old school, but they just outfought them and just took the game away from them in their own backyard. Just kudos to the Jaguars. There was a job well done, although no one expected them to do it. You got to give them credit where it's due. They just did a very good job that day.
Brunell finished the game with 245 yards passing with 2 touchdowns, and that was good enough to get the Jags into the AFC Championship game where they would go up against Bill Parcells and the New England Patriots playing at old Foxborough Stadium, which I've always said was a glorified high school stadium, but because of the way it looked. But they have a chance to go to the AFC Championship game. They've gone up against Bledsoe and a young Curtis Martin, and Willie McGinnis, and those early Patriots, the pre-Tom Brady Patriots that made the Super Bowl with Drew Bledsoe, which was I think he was in his second or third year in the league, and he had just set all kind of passing records for the Patriots during that time. So we're going to take this in chronological order. The NFC Championship game was first that afternoon. Packers at the Panthers at the Packers at Lambeau Field. Temperature at kickoff, 8 degrees. And they just could not stop the run. It was Darcy Levin's afternoon. Darcy Levins had not only had 117 yards receiving, but he had 88 yards rushing. And it was a Darcy Levin's afternoon. Brett Favre really didn't have to do much. Packers had a 17-10 lead and scored 13 unanswered points in the second half and ended up winning 30. What was it? 30. I forgot to write down the scores, but anyway,
30-13.
30-13.
It was 30-13.
And the Packers with that team ended up going on to the Super Bowl with the aforementioned Desmond Howard, who was on that team by this point. And from what I remember of that game, Chuck, it just seemed like the Panthers was more concerned about the weather than it was about the Packers, because I remember Kerry Collins constantly, he had that muffler on around his waist, and he just kept fiddling with it the whole game. And I think the Panthers were just so concerned about how cold it was, and the Packers, of course, playing at Lambeau Field outside in those elements, they were used to it. And I think that the Panthers just looked so out of sync that whole game. Kerry Collins didn't really have a great game. They really couldn't establish the running attack with the Panthers run game, and they could not stop Darcy Levins doing that game and Mark Shimura and that group.
Yeah, they just couldn't. They couldn't do it. They just couldn't do it. And then to that point, it had 8 degrees. I mean, especially on your hand, it's just
right.
It's hard to overcome. You have to have some mental fortitude to overcome that for sure. And then, to your point, you mentioned Dorsey Levens. He had 10 rushes, 88 yards. But then also, you remember they had Edgar Bennett too, and then William Henderson was paving the way for both of them. So they were just tag teaming on them in all of that. And then you also had Keith Jackson and Andre Wise and Mark Chimera, as you mentioned before. They were just all of them were making timely plays, and they just kind of dominated the line of scrimmage. And it just seems like the Panthers were just playing catch up the whole game. And then even though they were a very good team, they're not a team really designed to win high scoring games. And then B, with the inexperience at quarterback, as well as the lack of explosiveness at receiver at the time, they're not constructed to kind of quickly chew into large deficits either. They're kind of more of like a a grind, smash and pound type of team. So
Right.
they were immediately taken out of their element, and they were kind of vanquished rather easily by the Packers.
Now, the other game, the AFC Championship game, which took place later that afternoon at Foxborough, it wasn't quite as cold in Foxborough, but it was cold enough. And it was more of a rock fight than the other game. The Jaguars was in the game for most of it. It was 13-6 heading into the fourth quarter. It was a low scoring defensive type of game until the fourth quarter. The Patriots put the game away. Natron Means fumbled, recovered by Otis Smith, and he ran it 47 yards for the game-winning touchdown, making the score 20-6, ending the Jags' miracle run to the AFC Championship game. And this is one of those AFC champions. These is one of those championship games that I remember the game, but I don't remember it. It was like I remember watching the game because I went back and watched like the highlights of it and maybe like some plays from it, and I was like, I remember that, but I don't remember it. Like how you would watch a game and you kind of remember like where you were and who you were with or that sort of thing. For me, I don't have any
Yes.
recollection. I have no recollection of that at all. Now I remember watching it. Now I remember like because I was like really rooting for Jacksonville because the Panthers had lost. I was like, at least have somebody that one of these expansion teams make it. And what ended up happening, none of them made it. So it is what it was, but it marked the end of Jacksonville's Jacksonville and Carolina's remarkable run, in the playoffs. And Jacksonville's was probably more memorable because of what happened the week before in Denver.
Yes, and then it was to your point. I remember watching that game, and I remember, the Patriots had like Keith Byers and
Yeah,
Ben Coates and,
yeah,
guys like that, and Drew Bledsoe, Willie McGinnis, guys like that, and Otis Smith, but I don't remember much about it either. I do remember that, every now and then it's these games where, even though the score is technically close and the team is technically in the game, technically from a mathematical standpoint, it just seemed like the Jags were never in the game, really. It just kind of, and this is an era where, whereas now, even if a team is down 10 now, that doesn't seem like an insurmountable deficit. Back then, especially depending on the flow of the game, a 7-point lead, though not really significant mathematically, but in the context of the game, sometimes though that can be a significant margin, and I just feel that the way that the Jaguars were not moving the ball that way, that
right.
7 just seemed like such a huge deficit, and it just seems like they were just never, kind of in the game. They would put together a couple of drives, maybe move the chains a couple of times, and then inevitably the drive would stall, and then they'll punt, and then pretty much rinse and repeat, playing field position,
Right.
and then the death knell was the fumble return, and they were, Adam Vinatieri kid. Good God, how long was he around? Man,
Exactly. He was on
around way
that
back in
team.
'96.
He was on that team, right?
Yeah, so it was like, then they also had 4 turnovers, which doesn't help a lot either.
No.
And it just, they were just never in the game. And, and then eventually over time, they just become resigned to their fate. Okay, we had a great year. And then you're thinking that that's just the beginning. And then, even though they made a few more runs, they never quite got to that level with that group, not until years later, Jack Del Rio, David Garrard, Fred Taylor, etc.
Right, exactly. So that was a look back at the first Jacksonville Jaguars and the Carolina Panthers. And coming up right after our short break, we're going to be back to send a shout out to somebody who is an integral part of those early Panther teams. In fact, he is the only member of the Carolina Panthers up to this point to have his number retired by their organization. Number 51, who got his start actually in the USFL. So So stay tuned for that. We're coming back right after the short break. You are listening to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, a member of the Sports History Network. And we're back, and you're listening to the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, the podcast that gives you the best of sports from back in the day. I'm Dana Augusta, along with my partner in crime, my co-host Charles Combs, once again joining us on this Sunday afternoon. And if you look on the calendar, as we are recording this, we are in the midst of week 2 in the NFL's early part of the regular season. And so far, so good for my Chargers, even though they don't even play till Monday night against the Raiders. So anyway, talking about the Carolina Panthers and the Jacksonville Jaguars, the early parts of their franchise history, and one of the more interesting people, not only players, not only great players of the early Carolina Panthers, but one of the more interesting people to have ever donned the electric blue and black uniforms of the Carolina Panthers is somebody that coined the motto of keep pounding. And if you've ever seen a Carolina Panthers home game, they wheel out a big, huge drum. And there's the words keep pounding written on the drum. And that was a motto coined by the late, great middle linebacker of the Panthers, the early Panthers, a man by the name of Sam Mills. Now, he was nicknamed the Field Mouse during his time at Montclair State when he was, in the late 70s. And mainly because of his size. He was only 5'9" as a middle linebacker. Even in the 70s in Division III college, that's small. But he had the heart of a lion in case of a field mouse. In fact, Carl Peterson, the future, general manager of the Kansas City Chiefs, he met him when he was the general manager of the USFL's Philadelphia/Baltimore Stars. And he's essentially said that Sam Mills was a field mouse within a league of elephants that wanted no part of him. Okay, he may have been small, but he was athletic as the day is long, but he was such a fearsome, hard-hitting defender. Mills started at Montclair State from 1977 to 1980 and set several school records with 501 career tackles, 142 single-season tackles, and the most tackles in a single game with 22. He signed with the Cleveland Browns, but never got off of that practice squad. But it wasn't until he joined the USFL's Philadelphia-Baltimore Stars, coached by future Saints coach Jim Mora, where he really got a shot. He led the Stars to 2 USFL championships with the Philadelphia/Baltimore Stars and anchored a defense that was nicknamed the Doghouse Defense of the Philadelphia Stars. It was a 3-time All-USFL team member. Then he followed his coach from the Philadelphia Stars to the New Orleans Saints in 1985, but it wasn't until 1987 with the famed Dome Patrol that he really got his notoriety. Teamed up with Vaughn Johnson, Ricky Jackson, and Pat Swilling, they dominated NFL's NFC offenses during the late 1980s. He had 4 Pro Bowl appearances, and Jim Mora called Sam Mills the best player he ever coached. Now, Chuck, as a Saints fan and as somebody who has watched a number of Saints games during that era, for what I remember of Sam Mills, he was like one of the smallest players out there, but it's also one of the hardest hitting linebackers that the NFL had at that time. But he was also very durable. He never seemed to ever really get hurt, and he was the integral part of that Saints Dome Patrol defense. Speak more about that defense. You was a fan of that team. You remember you and I both were young enough and watched that team every Sunday afternoon. Let's talk about Sam Mills and with the that Saints team back then.
Sam Mills, man, was just a dog, man. He just, just going back, he had to walk on at college, man. He had he couldn't get a fair shot because of his size. So he just, despite his great talent, he never got the opportunity up to that point due to his size. But he just had this big chip on his shoulder and played with it once he got to the Saints. And he was just, I would just say, just acute violence. He was very smart in terms of diagnosing plays, X's and O's, lining the defense up correctly, getting everybody on the right page. But he would just shoot like he was shot out of a cannon and just always played downhill. Like that pulling guard when they try to run that football, he would blow that guard up, man, and just stuff everything. And he was just a great player along with Pat Swilling, Ricky Jackson, and Von Johnson too. He just was very good, and they brought some respectability to a perennial doormat, and it just the home patrol. They were just ferocious. He was just like you said. He was just athletic. He could just go all day long. He was just always durable, but he just always was ready to play. Never took a day off and never took a play off. He just was always ready to play. And it was just so much fun to watch them just wreak entire havoc on most teams, especially when it was a team that was just completely overmatched in the dome and they just had no way of blocking all of that. These were the days when, you could get the ref to stop, call timeout because the crowd was too loud and all of that. This was those days. And he was just a pleasure to watch and just violent and just a fierce competitor and a fierce hitter.
That's right. And he was also somewhat of their spiritual leader as well. I remember they had an NFL Films thing on him, and they did the NFL Films, I think, mic'd him up, and he was like, if I'm not mistaken, they were playing the Bears this one particular Sunday in the Dome, and he had him mic'd up, and he was like, he said, one of his teammates, he said, "You see that guy over there walking around with that Panama Jack hat?" And he said, "Yeah." He said, "You know who that is?" You say, "No, that's Dick Butkus." He's like, "That's the reason why we're number 51, because of him, Dick Butkus." And for those of you, and I know a lot of people who listen to this show know who Dick Butkus is. Every time I see Dick Butkus, his highlight film, I ask myself, all the stuff that he did, how was all of that legal? Because he patterned his game after Dick Butkus, but at the same time, he wasn't as skirting the law, so to speak, as Dick Butkus was. But he was just as hard a hitter. He was just as a tenacious defender, but he was way more athletic than Dick Butkus. But at the same time, he was right up there as far as like pure talent and talent-wise. What was Paul Brown was the one who said that you can't coach talent, you can't measure talent or something of that nature. But he had all of the talent in the world, and it all came in a 5'9" frame. At the end of the '94 season, he left as a free agent after the '94 season to become part of the expansion draft of the Carolina Panthers. And he came there as a free agent. He was the only player in Panthers history up to that point to start every game in the Panthers' first 3 years of existence. So the 95, 96, and 97 season, he ended up playing every game, every snap for the Carolina Panthers, leading them all the way to the NFC Championship game against Green Bay after the 1996 season. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2005 to intestinal cancer, but every Panthers game, he's recognized with the keep pounding drum, because that was his motto: keep pounding, keep pounding, keep pounding. And Chuck, I'm going to end it with you, man. Any last words about Sam Mills?
Well, Sam Mills, man, great player. And as I mentioned before, of course, the Saints are going to do Saints things. He left the Saints because the Carolina Panthers offered him 2 years, $2.8 million deal. But the Saints waited for him to establish the market. So while the Saints matched their offer, he was pissed that they waited until the Panthers made the offer first and just said, screw it, I'm out anyway. And then proceeded to go to the Panthers and give the Saints hell twice a year for 3 seasons. And he was just a great player. And from all accounts, even a better person. And as you know, like post-playing career, fought courageously with cancer with every bit of the vigor and spirit that he exemplified as a player. You know, he ultimately lost that battle, but he's still in our hearts, still in a lot of hearts of Carolina. And I think he's one of the few players in the league that has a number retired for 2 different teams. Matter of fact. And all that. Or do the Saints even have his number? I think the Saints have his number retired. I know the Panthers do for sure. And he was just
I think he does. I think they
maybe they don't. And if the Saints don't,
shame on them, right?
Well, if they don't have his number retired, I wouldn't be surprised because, of course, they're the Saints. So, and the crazy part of it is they got rid of him. We haven't had a good middle linebacker with the exception of Jonathan Vilma for a few seasons and Mario Davis for a few years. He's past his prime now, but he's been serviceable too. But other than that, they haven't had a good middle linebacker since. And he was just a wonderful player and an all-time great player and sorely missed.
Thank you once again, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us on this all-new edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. Once again, this podcast comes to you from the Bill King Memorial Studio in the sports wing of TM4 Enterprises located in suburban Atlanta in the shadow of Stone Mountain. And once again, please don't forget to like and subscribe this show. And also, if you'd like to contact us for any reason, please send us an email at historically.speaking.sports@gmail.com. Once again, that email, historically.speaking.sports@gmail.com. And as always, please tell people about us. Tell your family, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell your coworkers. Hell, tell a passerby on the street if you think that they like sports history. And once again, please remember to subscribe to our show. And once again, please be good to each other, be nice to each other, and be your best in everything that you do because it will make the world a much, much better place. Until next time, I'm Dana Augusta along with Charles Combs telling you goodbye and see you next time.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
The Sports History Network, where legends live on and the past plays loud. Welcome to the place where history's proud. From gridiron glory to the hardwood stars, from the racetrack heat to Olympic bars. It's the voices, the stories, the moments you miss, told by fans and pros who live for this. Hook and Themic, the Sports History Network, where the past comes alive. Podcasts and blogs that keep the flame high. From Babe to Brady, Alley to the Dome. If it's history and sports, then this is the home. SportsHistoryNetwork.com, the headquarters of sports yesteryear.